A warm summer breeze blows outside, showing a tranquil scene. However, the inside of the house tells a different story.
The Romanovs were shut in the house for over the past 3 months, slowly losing contacts and food. On this night, though, their suffering would be put to a merciless end.
The cause of the Romanovs' demise was primarily Russia's economic decline, which was primarily due to their involvement in World War I. The resulting food shortages caused multiple public protests during 1916 and early 1917, with increasing number and more violence. Some called for bread and peace, while others called for an end to the war and even the monarchy. In one protest, the soldiers were forced to fire on the crowds to try to keep them under control. But as a result, since many of the soldiers felt more empathy for the crowds than the Tsar, over 80,000 troops mutinied and joined the crowd. During the months that followed the February 23rd protest, the Duma began meeting in secret and ultimately called for a full-scale revolution. On March the 2nd, Nicholas II abdicated and a provisional government was established in Petrograd. It's important to bear in mind that the February Revolution was largely spontaneous.
Many political groups, though, including rivaling political groups, began to cooperate. That is, until the arrival of Vladimir Lenin on April 3rd, 1917. The Communist Party finally regained control on August 31st in Petrograd and in Moscow in September. Lenin met resistance with his own party, but went ahead with his plans for revolution. October 24th, 1917. Little happened on this day, the first day of the Russian Revolution. In a disguise, Lenin made his way across town to the Smolny Institute. Late that evening, Bolshevik troops occupied crucial points in the capital. Not a single shot was fired, as the Junkers were assigned to guard these sites either fled or were disarmed without incident. Even the headquarters of the General Staff, the Army headquarters, was taken without resistance.
By the next morning, the Winter Palace was the only government building that had not yet been taken. At 9 a.m., Kerensky fled the city in a car taken from the U.S. Embassy. The other ministers remained in the palace, thinking that Kerensky would return with reinforcements. Meanwhile, Bolshevik forces brought a warship, the cruiser Aurora, up the Neva River and took up a position near the palace.
Although the palace was weakly defended, most of the Bolshevik soldiers were unwilling to fire on fellow Russians or on the buildings of the Russian capital. Instead, small groups broke into the palace and convinced many of the guards to give up, and little or no violence ensued. The ministers were arrested shortly after 2:00 a.m. on October 26 and escorted to prison cells. Kerensky escaped abroad, never to return.
Late in the evening of October 25th, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets debated about Bolshevik and Russian leadership. Adjourning after 5 a.m. on October 26th, the Congress resumed once more late that evening, and several important decisions were made during this session. The first motion approved was Lenin's decree of peace, which declared Russia's wish for World War I to end, but did not go as far as to declare a ceasefire. The next matter was to be passed was the Decree of Land, which officially socialized all land in the country for redistribution to peasant communes. Finally, a new provisional government was formed to replace the old one until the Constituent Assembly met in November as scheduled. The new government was called the Soviet People's Commissars, SPC. Lenin was its chairman and all of its members were Bolsheviks. As defined by the Congress, the SPC was tasked to answer to a newly elected executive committee chaired by Lev Kamenev, which in turn would answer to the Constituent Assembly.
Russian life changed a little at first. Few understood the new government and what it meant if it lasted. Power struggles in Moscow lasted nearly a week. Everyone took power for themselves, and anarchy ruled the countryside, with peasants seizing whatever land they wanted. The new Bolshevik-led government, with no long-term plan and only vague intentions, improvised policy on the fly.
The so-called Great October Socialist Revolution was fairly mundane and anticlimactic. Due to little resistance, the Bolsheviks were able to extend power quickly. The effects of the original bloodless violence became earth-shaking when the country came to grips with what had happened. Lenin believed sincerely in the cause and was not motivated by sheer thirst for power.
November 1917 through January 1918. One of the primary goals of Lenin's government after they gained control was to get Russia out of World War I. Lenin called for everyone to cease hostilities, but was ignored. In 1917, the new government ordered all Russian troops to cease fighting. On December 15th, an armistice was found between Russia and Germany. The exit was very costly, as Lenin had to give up most of Russia's territorial gains from the times of Peter the Great, most of which would not be regained until World War II.
Following the revolution and the Second Congress of Soviets, Lenin's government, the SPC, faced the overwhelming task of governing a country in chaos. Communication was poor, and large chunks of the country, including the Ukraine, were still occupied by foreign armies. Outside of Petrograd and Moscow, especially in more distant regions such as Siberia and Central Asia, it was hard even to define what was happening politically, much less to take control of it. Lenin, expecting the Bolsheviks to do well, allowed elections for the members of the Constituent Assembly to proceed as scheduled throughout the month of November. When the final tally was in, however, Bolshevik candidates received less than 25% of the vote. Because the Bolsheviks placed only modestly in the elections, the Constituent Assembly became a problem for them. Initially, it appeared that the Bolsheviks might have to make some severe compromises in order to stay in power, but they eliminated the Cadet Party and would dissolve the Constituent Assembly. The Assembly was replaced by the Third Congress of Soviets, 94% of whose members were required to be Bolshevik or SR delegates. The new group quickly ratified a motion that the term provisional be removed from the official description of the SPC, making Lenin and the Bolsheviks the permanent rulers of the country. Until this point, the Bolsheviks had often used the word democracy in a positive sense, but this changed almost instantly. The Bolsheviks began to categorize their critics as counter-revolutionaries and threaten them as traitors. The terms revolutionary dictatorship and dictatorship of the proletariat began to pop up frequently in Lenin's speeches, which began to characterize democracy as an illusionary concept propagated by Western capitalists.
March 1918. Even as Lenin's representatives were taking Russia out of World War II, the Bolsheviks were moving their capital to Moscow to consolidate power. Although symbolism of this sort was a major part of the Bolsheviks' strategy, they also knew that they also needed hard power to force the rest of the country to conform to their vision while discouraging potential foreign invaders from interfering. Therefore, they rebuilt their military force, which now largely consisted of 35,000 Latvian riflemen who had sided with the Bolsheviks when they vowed to remove Russia from World War I. The Latvian soldiers were better trained and more disciplined than the Russian forces upon which the Bolshevik forces had previously relied. These troops effectively suppressed insurrections throughout Russia at one time and formed the early core of the Red Army. The other major instrument of Bolshevik power was the secret police, known by the Russian acronym Cheka, for Extraordinary Commission to Combat Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. Officially formed on December 20, 1917, the Cheka was charged with enforcing compliance with Bolshevik rule. At its command, Lenin placed a Polish revolutionary named Felix Dzierżynski, who would soon become notorious for the deadly work of his organization. Tens of thousands of people would be murdered by the Cheka during the coming years. The Russian Civil War, which started in mid-1918, came about because of what happened during the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks' actions after they took power. A contingent of about 500,000 Czech and Slovak soldiers rebelled when they were threatened to be put in the army. The soldiers seized a portion of the Trans-Siberian Railway and attempted to make their way across Siberia to Russian Pacific coast in order to escape Russia by boat. The soldiers eventually joined the Whites. The Bolsheviks responded by instituting military conscription in May 1918 to bolster their forces. At the end of the summer, on August 30th, there was an assassination attempt on Lenin. He survived, but a brutal crackdown on all forms of opposition commenced shortly thereafter. The Bolsheviks called it the Red Terror, and it fully lived up to its name. This was the atmosphere under which the Russian Civil War began. It lasted well into 1920 to 1921, by which point the Bolsheviks had fully crushed the rebellion. The Bolsheviks faced major opposition from within Russia, and for many different reasons. Among the most contentious issues was Russia's costly exit from World War I. Though many had wanted out of the war, they did not approve of Lenin's readiness to lose vast amounts of territory. In addition, the Bolsheviks' sudden dismissal of the Constituent Assembly and their silencing of all other political voices were offensive to many as well. The years following, with the violence of Joseph Stalin's purges and forced collectivization of Russia's lands, would not be much better.